Well, thanks for joining us again as we continue what we started in our worship service today. This is Dr. Ron Henderson. He's our district superintendent. He's a United Methodist pastor. And we've been talking about racism and particularly his experience as an African American, as well as a call to our church about what we can do to be a transformative force in our society and culture. I thought what we do is just kind of dig a little deeper into some of the issues that we touched on during the sermon time in our worship service. And Ron, if you'll kind of start out by giving, a lot of times we hear the word systemic racism, and we have misunderstandings about that. Give us kind of an overview. What is systemic racism?
When I hear systemic racism, I understand it is racism that is historically embedded in institutions that have historically discriminated against people of color. It's historic, it's in institutions, and it has its history in racism, in segregation, in Jim Crowism, maybe even roots back to 1619, when Africans were first brought to this land.
Right. So you say institutions. Say a little more. What when we say institutions, what are we talking about there?
When I say institutions, those institutions that serve the citizenry, but may not serve people of color at the same level, same adequacy, certainly not at the same equality as it does the broader society. As an example, if you look at segregated schools, they were supposed to be separate but equal, and the Supreme Court ruled in 1954 that they were not equal. And so those persons who went to segregated schools did not get the same quality of education as the majority of the community did. And even since integration, maybe for the most part in the inner cities, those persons still do not get adequate education. And if you don't have adequate education, then you're not going to be able to participate in life, get accepted in the institutions, because you're not on the same level with someone else.
Right.
An example would be if you were to call your insurance agent and ask for a quote on your car and gave a Carrollton residence, you would get one figure. If you call back with the same make of car and you gave a zip code from South Dallas, I guarantee you would get a different quote. And it wouldn't be because they have more accidents or get more tickets, but because of the color of that citizenry's skin. Those would be examples. And so persons like you and others are not aware of how a broad portion of society is discriminated against. Now, I'm grateful to God that, I've been able to get quality education, quality housing, a very good career, live in a residency community that's safe. And so I'm grateful to God for that. And I'm a beneficiary of that movement of the 1960s. But there's so many people who seemingly are trapped.
We didn't talk about this earlier, but it just really kind of hit me as you were talking about the institutions, that the most segregated time in our nation is Sunday morning. And we have distinctly African American churches, distinctly Latin American, distinctly white. There's some integration there. How can we, as a spiritual body, cross those boundaries?
Well, I've been hearing a long time, as you have, that Sunday morning at 11 o'clock is the most segregated time in America's life. And not to excuse anything that's racist, I really think it's that statement is really overstated.
Okay.
Martin Luther King Jr. did not fight for an integrated society as much as he fought for a free society.
Equal.
Freedom is choice. Freedom is the choice to go to an all-black school or to go to an integrated school. Freedom is a choice to worship here or to worship somewhere else. And so people are going to worship in a context that is familiar to them, that's satisfying to them. And so long as it's freedom and all is welcome, I think that's what matters. I've pastored predominantly black churches, and I pastored a predominantly white church. And African Americans who came to the church and saw me there, so we're really glad you're here. We'll see you Christmas Eve or some other time, because culturally it did not satisfy them. And that's just a reality. So I don't think the segregated hour on Sunday mornings is indicative of racism as much as we want to make it.
Yeah, okay. Well, you and I we talked the other day about Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail, and his message really to Christian leaders, particularly white Christian leaders. And I read that letter. It had a really big impact on me. Kind of unpack that letter and the message that MLK was sharing with the religious leaders of that day, and how it could be a word for us today.
Yes, actually, when he wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail, he was responding to their criticism of him. I think it was a week after an election, and actually he had a march planned before the election, so he chose not to do it. And the white leadership and clergy condemned him for, they said, his timing was bad and it was not good timing. And so he unpacks it by, anytime is a good time to bring about justice. Anytime is a good time to bring about equality. But he also made a point that a great part of his despair was because of the white clergy who were silent and did not speak out against injustice and intentional oppression and racial inequality.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, as we have, even before the George Floyd situation and others were happening, I was wondering to myself, when is the church going to say enough is enough?
Yeah.
And stand up and do something about it. And of course now, people all across the land have taken a good stance. And I hope they are not ahead of the church. When they get ahead of the church, then you get looting and rioting, which was so different from the movement of the 1960s, because it was a church movement.
Right.
And the night before any march or protest, they have this service, which was a kind of a service of purification. And people were trained in nonviolence. Not only were they trained in nonviolence, because the impact of the movement was not merely not to fight back, but to clothe oneself in the righteousness of Christ.
Wow.
And so when they marched and protested, they were armed in the righteousness of God. And so they were able to take some of the abuse. As a matter of fact, when they went through the period of purity and worship and consecration the night before, Dr. King would say to people, if you're not willing to take abuse for this cause, then you don't need to protest. If you have a tendency to fight back, then you don't need to be in this protest. If you can't love those who despise you, then you don't need to be in this protest. So one of the things that I've thought about a lot lately is we really see a lot of Dr. King's activism, but we really miss his righteousness. He got a method from Gandhi, but he was committed to the teachings and principles of Jesus Christ. And that's the only way we can do it, is to fight like Jesus taught us to fight.
Yeah. One of the paragraphs, he was going after some of the white religious leaders, and he quoted them or paraphrased them by saying, you have pointed out to me how much change there has been.
Yes.
And I point out to you how much change there needs to be, and we cannot put a timetable on justice.
Yes.
And I thought, man,
very well done.
You know, as you look at what's happened here, you know, George Floyd, what was done was wrong. I mean, it was horrible. But he's really kind of become a symbol for maybe a new movement. And where do you hope that this movement can go, not just for our culture, but also for our churches, maybe both and?
Well, I think, first of all, I would begin by saying what happened to George Floyd was more than wrong.
It was horrible.
It was horrible. It was wickedness at its worst.
Demonic.
Demonic. When a police officer put his knee on his neck while he begged for air, and then put his hands in his pocket and looked around as if he was amused by what was happening to this poor soul. So I think we have to call racism what it is. It is demonic, it is wickedness, it is not of God, because all of us were created in the image of God. So I start there. This could be an opportunity where people are galvanized, and we understand that as much as some people don't want to hear it, Black Lives Matter. Now, let me unpack that for you.
Okay.
Sometimes we say blue lives matter, and blue lives do matter.
Now, your dad was
my
a
dad
police
was a peace officer, sheriff deputy. Their lives matter. But if an officer is killed, then the entire community responds to that death because it's important. And what has happened to George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor has happened again and again and again. And African Americans say these things keep happening and nobody pays attention to them. And so it's a cry out that these lives matter. I saw a video right before I came here of an incident in Austin, Texas, a couple of months ago, that the tape has been hidden, of an African-American man who was arrested and died at the hands of police, who cried out, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." And he had congested heart failure, and he died. And so Black Lives Matter is to say, this happens too routinely. And so that's what's behind that, is to call attention to the broader society of what's happening to a particular group of people.
What, as you watch just really the peaceful protest, I'm not talking about the riots and the destruction and the opportunism, but the peaceful, and you said this earlier when we were worshiping, that it's a racially mixed protest. That it's not just African Americans. And there's a lot of energy right now. Do you think we can keep that going?
Well, first of all, it's diversity, not only in terms of race, but also diversity in terms of gender, and diversity in terms of age. The young, the middle-aged, and older people are participating. I'm hopeful, I'm prayerful that America as a whole have seen this horrific incident and know that it has happened too often and have said enough is enough. Now, having said that, I'm not one who believes or advocate defunding police departments. But I am one who advocates accountability and responsibility for police departments. I don't know how you can take money from police departments that are already underfunded, but there has to be more money put into community programming. And so I'm for honest Christian policing.
Right. Yeah. One of the phrases that I've heard you use before is a phrase, transformative action. Transformative action. And how do we live into a more transformative action? Or I'll just say it this way. My fear is that this will be kind of a wave, an emotional wave of response because of the horrific nature of George Floyd's death and the reminder of the societal problems that we have, and then it'll just die down and return to normal. So how can we really live into this transformative, or maybe this is a better question. How can this be a new normal?
Well, it certainly will be a new normal for black people. Black people who, as I said, where police are routinely suspicious of them, routinely rude, routinely arrested at a higher rate. That is their normal. That is our normal. We're looking for a new normal where that does not happen anymore. I think there's a good possibility that this will be a lasting, transforming movement. But the movement can have many parts to it. And I think each person can define, and institutions, how they're going to live out that moment. For example, for me, as I shared with you the other day, as the scripture said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons, and I paraphrase, daughters of God.
Children of God.
I'm going to be a peacemaker. That doesn't mean I'm indifferent to racism. Doesn't mean I'm indifferent to brutality. It doesn't mean I'm indifferent to brutality at the hands of police officers. I'm not. But my spirituality, my communion with God, leads me to fight the fight of faith. So I think persons can define for themselves how we usher in a better community, a better society, where people are not judged by the color of their skin, but really by their character. Hopefully it will be truly a moral crusade, and that we see the image of God in every human being.
Yeah.
Not to see that I think is sinful.
Oh, yeah. I just, I look at the inequities in our school systems, and I look at the inequities of the justice system, and it almost seems hopeless, and yet I know we can change it. And that's, I guess, where I struggle. What can I do?
Well, when we see the inequities in, say, public education, we're not talking Carrollton.
No.
We're not talking Denton County, Collin County. We're talking urban America. That's where there's inequity. Regardless of what color you're in Carrollton, you're probably going to get a good public education. I think we have to understand that these things take place, but I can't tell individuals what their strategy is going to be. I think as a preacher, we can be prophetic and say this is not of God, that it is wrong, and that we have a responsibility to advance God's kingdom all over the land, where God righteousness reigns everywhere.
Oh, you know, when I think about the kingdom of heaven on earth, that's what I see, you know, and I think that's what God wants and is moving us toward in this journey.
Yes, I think for me that means God's will in heaven is lived out on earth.
I just wish we could bring them closer together and pull the curtain apart, you know, so that the kingdom of heaven could have more influence than the kingdoms here.
Well, I guess it started individually with our own right living, with our own right value system, with our own core values, where we don't allow racism, evil to manifest itself in us in any way, regardless of our color. That's why I don't watch certain things on television, so that they don't get into my psyche and my being and my DNA. And if I watch, you know, violent movies, then that stuff get all in me. So I, for the most part, don't watch it. I don't even watch, what do I call it, scary movies.
Horror movies?
You know, horror movies. Because I don't want that spirit in me. I don't want it in my house. I don't want it in my mind. I don't want it in my thought. I don't let people talk around me certain ways, because I don't want those words that are living to get all in my psyche. And so I think we have to begin by being faithful to God. And we can talk Christianity all we want to talk, but until we have a life of devotion to God, it's just words. Right. So the core of anything that I do begins with my devotion to God.
Yeah. Kind of drawing this to a close, I know you've done a lot of research on this subject. Where would you lead us in terms of authors to read, particular books that could be foundational to bring greater understanding and a real connection to action?
I think to go back and read King, awesome stuff. I'm rereading King. A good person to read, who I think is one of the most underappreciated modern-day mystics, is Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman was an African-American who was dean of college at Boston University when Dr. King was there, and was one of the leading advisors to Dr. King on the teachings of Jesus and the righteousness of God. Howard Thurman is certainly a good one. A modern-day person who I love is Cornel West.
Cornel West.
Cornel West is a professor at Princeton University, and I think he's has a very fresh, creative voice. He's one of the persons I love to read. He's really engaged in truth-telling, but a wonderful human being.
Sure.
I understand from Andy Lewis that our website in the conference has a bibliography of books and authors to look at.
Yeah, I noticed, I remember her first name was Austin because she had a boy's name. And I'll try to get that and publish it for our congregation. But she's done a lot of writing for Christianity Today also, and she's very challenging. I've read some of her stuff because I went on the website and for some reason her work kind of stood out to me. But I think we've reached a point where we need to be challenged. You know, we need to be challenged. Well,
I think we need to be challenged, but I think we also need to be confronted.
Confronted.
Yes. There will be no change, there will be no transformation without truth-telling in love. You know, if you were as a pastor visiting with any person of your parish who had an addiction, you would be engaged in truth-telling with love, and you know that person wouldn't overcome until they were confronted with the truth. And so I think we have to begin with confrontation doesn't mean that it's belligerent or boisterous. It means we just confronted you with the truth. So I think being confronted with truth-telling is where I would begin.
Okay. All right. Any last words for us?
I truly pray and believe that we will have one nation and not a divided nation. And that if we're going to have one nation under God, the church has to take the lead in making that a reality.
Yeah.
So regardless of all that has happened and my own brokenness and pain, I'm ultimately hopeful and optimistic.
Yeah. Nothing is too great for our God.
No, sir.
Nothing.
Absolutely nothing.
Nothing. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
God bless you.
God bless you.
Can you get enough from that, Lauren?